From the video, we can see two Filipino crew members holding filming equipment. One of them walked towards the rear cabin, while the other immediately climbed up the gangway to take over his filming position. We can observe that every Filipino ship is well equipped with filming equipment and personnel. This indicates that the Philippines had long anticipated the occurrence of this maritime friction. Within hours of the incident, the Philippine side quickly released official statements and media reports, clearly presenting pre-prepared ready-made narratives that had been crafted before the incident. All the signs suggest that the Philippines deliberately planned, executed, and manufactured this maritime friction.
And the mere fact that countries like Vietnam, for instance, are becoming more and more vocal against Chinese atrocities is a clear illustration that even they realize, for instance, that China's desire to expand has no favorites, shows no favorites, and eventually Southeast Asian countries, regardless of alignment, would fall victim to this initial expansionism. And, we've seen that.
Kind of obvious questions that I and a lot of people have is how is it can both the Chinese side and the Philippine side both be citing international law to justify their positions? How can international law be that ambiguous so that both can claim legitimacy in their positions on these territorial disputes?
When it comes to bilateral relationship, we would clearly see the Philippines working with China on different areas of cooperation. That would continue. Keeping all lines of communication open, that would also continue. Now, the challenge here is to what point China will try to continue pushing the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea.
The China Global South podcast is supported in part by the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg and by our subscribers. Thank you. If you'd like to subscribe for daily news and exclusive analysis about every aspect of China's engagement in Africa, Asia, and throughout the developing world, go to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China Global South podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander. Today, we're going to take a look at the growing tensions between China and the Philippines over their territorial dispute in the South China Sea. Now, regular listeners of the show and subscribers to our newsletter will know this is a topic we've been covering in depth for the better part of 2 years, but the situation flared again last week when a China Coast Guard ship and a Philippines Bureau of Fisheries and Aquatic Resources ship collided with one another near the contested Scarborough Shoal. Now, the China Coast Guard ship also deployed high-powered water cannons against the smaller Filipino vessel, and that triggered a lot of outrage once again in the Philippines, and has been the case for much of the past 2 years. This latest incident just also triggered a flurry of condemnations from both sides, with each blaming the other for being at fault. The Chinese government said it's not to blame for the latest collision and accused the Philippine side for provoking the incident. Let me just quickly read what Foreign Ministry spokesperson Lin Jian said at the regular press briefing in Beijing in response to a Bloomberg reporter's question about the incident. He said, and I'm quoting here, "The Philippines' claim is not factual. China has indisputable sovereignty. It is legitimate and lawful for China to carry out law enforcement activities in relevant waters to uphold sovereignty." Again, no ambiguity in those statements. Not surprisingly, Lin's remarks did not go down well in Manila. Philippines Defense Minister Gilberto Deodoro was asked to respond, and he was very blunt.
Well, the claim that the area where the incident happened is their territory is really a lie, a bold-faced lie. And it's not established under any norm of international law, save for their own, stealing of the same as their own, appropriating the same illegally. So I think they will just continue to go forward with this narrative while we have to work internally to strengthen ourselves and to work with like-minded nations such as Japan in order to counter this illegal narrative. As I said, we really need to build international voices of condemnation against this because the whole world does not support China. There is no visible there is no visible declaration of support for China's gratuitous claims in the South China Sea. But there is condemnation. So I think China will just continue to do what it does without regard to other people's rights, because that's what they can do.
You hear a real sense of frustration in the defense minister's voice, and it's because, in part, these confrontations have been happening at a regular frequency since February 2023. And you're getting a sense in many quarters in Manila and the Philippines that people are losing patience over what they perceive as Chinese harassment of Filipino ships operating in their exclusive economic zone, well within what they say are their territorial waters. So there were growing calls last week to say, enough. No more sending out these small, unarmed civilian vessels alone. It's time to deploy Philippine Navy warships on these resupply missions, saying basically to the Chinese, we're tired of you picking on us. Now, that discussion bubbled in the Philippines media for a few days until President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. quashed the idea, saying it would lead to a serious escalation in the confrontation with China, something he said he doesn't want to do.
We are going to continue to perform our mission. We will never be part of an escalation in the situation in the West Philippine Sea. If we look at the evolution of the situation in the West Philippine Sea, the Philippines has never been an agent of escalation of tensions.
Now, while all this was happening in Manila, the Chinese presented a very different narrative over what happened. After Lin issued his remarks at the foreign ministry, Chinese state media swung into action to bolster Beijing's position. State-run broadcaster CGTN made the case in a report entitled, and again, this is very important, Evidence Substantiates Filipino Provocations in Huangyandao. Now, Huangyandao is the Chinese name for Scarborough Shoal. Both sides have their own names, and again, there's also an international nomenclature as well, so it gets very confusing just to keep track of the different names. But back to this report. The report featured an interview with Chen Shidi, an assistant professor at the China Institute for Marine Affairs, who referred to drone video of last week's confrontation to explain why the China Coast Guard was not to blame.
The Philippines' dispatch of vessels to intrude into territorial waters near China's Huangyandao constitutes an infringement on China's territorial sovereignty and a violation of international laws, such as the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea. This is the video released by the Philippine side. Well, they attempt to portray the large Chinese vessel as bullying a smaller government ship. The reality is that we can observe a deliberate urgent right turn and deceleration while navigating in parallel. Such unprofessional and unsafe maneuvers led to the collision, violating the international regulations for preventing collisions at sea.
Chen and the CGTN report also talked about China's frustration over how its actions in the South China Sea are framed by the Philippines in the international media. And this speaks to a long-standing gripe that the Chinese feel that they're not getting a fair shake. Now, they say that the Philippines have been very effective at getting their message out by inviting international journalists and social media influencers aboard their ships to document confrontations and then to broadcast them oftentimes in near real time. That's been part of a strategy known as assertive transparency, and the Chinese absolutely hate it because they say it distorts what they claim is really happening.
From the video, we can see two Filipino crew members holding filming equipment. One of them walked towards the rear cabin, while the other immediately climbed up the gangway to take over his filming position. We can observe that every Filipino ship is well equipped with filming equipment and personnel. This indicates that the Philippines had long anticipated the occurrence of this maritime friction. Within hours of the incident, the Philippine side quickly released official statements and media reports, clearly presenting pre-prepared ready-made narratives that had been crafted before the incident. All the signs suggest that the Philippines deliberately planned, executed, and manufactured this maritime friction.
Okay, here we are, 2 years into this, and there is no indication whatsoever, as you've heard from the various sound bites and the various positions, that either side is willing to make even the slightest concession right now. But there's a new variable at play in this confrontation that will come into effect on January 20th next year, and his name is Donald Trump. Let's get a perspective now on the situation from someone who's been following this standoff very closely. Don McLain Gill is a Manila-based geopolitical analyst, author, and lecturer at the Department of International Studies at De La Salle University in the Philippines. He is also a non-resident fellow at the Strat-based ADR Institute in Manila. Don, a very good afternoon to you, and thank you so much for joining us on the show for the first time.
A good afternoon to you too, Eric, and thank you very much for the invitation and for considering this discussion. I look forward to having it with you.
Yeah, it's great to have you on, and someone, again, who's been at the forefront in following this. I've just laid out the case of the past week. As you've heard, both sides at each other. No indication whatsoever that compromise is in the cards right now. When you heard both of these positions from the Chinese and the Philippine side, how do you explain what's going on to people who are not familiar with the situation?
You've done a great job in sort of outlining the contemporary situation. And we have to understand that this has been a protracted situation when it comes to understanding China's expansionist ambitions throughout the greater Indo-Pacific. Now, this does not just start 2 years ago. This was something that evolved even throughout the 20th century. Now, we have to understand that since the creation of the PRC, we see a general trend of China's expansionist interests throughout the greater Asia. Right? So we look into the Indian Ocean region and we look into the Western Pacific. There are clear indications of this. And when we talk about the greater South China Sea and the West Philippine Sea in particular, which we call the part of the South China Sea that encompasses the Philippines' lawful 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone, we see this as an integral part of China's expansionist desires. So clearly, what China is trying to do is trying to control this strategic space, particularly because if we look at it at the map, it serves as a considerable shield that when operationalized through military buildup, China can maximize and leverage its position here against the US, for instance, and to, of course, enhance its power projection. And of course, along with that, along with the power element, would be the resources within it as well. Now, when we had our previous administration a couple of years back, Beijing may have felt that it already, had the Philippines in its pocket, particularly when Manila pursued an appeasement approach towards China with a misplaced hope of receiving economic concessions, which did not really materialize. But eventually, towards the end of that administration, we saw a U-turn. Now, under the Marcos Jr. administration, there is a more reinvigorated position to secure Philippine sovereignty and sovereign rights based on international law. And that is directly contradictory to the interests of an expansive, expansionist, and aggressive state, right? So this is clearly frustrating to Beijing. And it is trying to do three things. It is trying to weaken Manila's political will. It is trying to augment the significance of the alliance network. And of course, to lower the morale of the Philippine military and the Coast Guard. So it is playing the long game. It has the time. It has the money. It is trying to wear down the Philippines. But to its frustration, the Philippines has been showing this reinvigorated position to continue, while also emphasizing that we are on the defensive. We are not poking the bear, as many in China and Chinese media outlets try to project. We are not poking the bear, but rather the bear is poking us. But we still maintain a defensive and principled position in defending what is rightfully ours.
Let's go back to President Marcos' predecessor, President Duterte, Rigoberto Duterte. According to the Chinese, and again, this is what they say, they had a gentleman's agreement. And I find that rather interesting because in international affairs, I've never heard that gentlemen's agreements are meaningful in any substantive way. But nonetheless, that is the phrasing that they used, that they had a gentleman's agreement that the shoals would be accessible to Filipino fishers, but at the same time that territorial sovereignty would be the Chinese. They now say that Marcos, when he came into power, and let's remember the first 6 months when Marcos came to power, it was not preordained that he was going to be confrontational with the Chinese. One of the first places that he visited was Beijing, and there was a lot of expectation that ties between the Philippines and China would continue to be stable, at least economically and on trade and other things. And then, as you pointed out, Marcos has taken a much more resilient attitude towards the Chinese in these territorial disputes. But talk to us about the change between Duterte and Marcos, because the Chinese think that's absolutely critical. And they say that Marcos now is acting as kind of a poodle to the Americans. They strip the agency away from the Philippines for asserting their own sovereignty rights here and say that they're just acting at the behest of the Americans. They didn't say that about Duterte. Can you give us a little bit of a background on the differences between what it was like under Duterte and Marcos today?
This is, in fact, a very important question to better understand the contemporary situation. So we had former President Rodrigo Duterte, who clearly sidelined the 2016 arbitral ruling, which eventually materialized during his administration, the first part of his administration, setting aside the principles of UNCLOS, for instance, in order to be on a more favorable side of Beijing, particularly when it comes to the hope of gaining economic concessions. But at the same time, however, we see the Philippines trying to show that it is cutting off its relationship with the U.S., again, as another symbol to appease China, because China has always been wary about U.S. presence and the fear of being contained within what we call today as the Indo-Pacific. Now, unfortunately, this led to several issues, right? And one of which was that it only emboldened China and its expansionist claims within Philippine waters. So 2017, for instance, China occupied Sandy Cay. 2019, China rammed a small fishing boat off the Philippines, leaving the crew to drown, right? It was actually the Vietnamese that helped us and our crew members. Early 2020s, we had the swarming of hundreds of Chinese maritime militia, the PLAN, and the China Coast Guard on key features within Philippine exclusive economic zones, such as the Whitsun Reef, for instance. So to say that an appeasement approach led to a stabilizing of the situation in the West Philippine Sea is just simply not true. What only occurred was that Manila was sweeping under the carpet the atrocities that have been committed by China against the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea at that point. However, we have to understand as well that public sentiment, along with the defense and foreign policy establishments, were not necessarily synchronous to what the president was eyeing for. So, for instance, in 2019, there were two major surveys, nationwide surveys, and this was at the peak of the Duterte administration. From Pulse Asia, for instance, and the Social Weather Survey in June and July in 2019, and a vast majority, a huge percentage, over 80% both, stated that Filipinos across the nation did not trust China and wanted the Philippines to become more assertive in securing the West Philippine Sea. Right? And if we look into the defense and foreign policy establishments, right, there were clear pushbacks against China's position within the West Philippine Sea. So we see this pushback from within as well, illustrating that whatever was trying to unfold from Manila's perspective, from former President Duterte's perspective, was actually a position that went against the grain, that eventually the Duterte administration had to take a U-turn at the end. And we see that he was more vocal about the need to secure Philippine waters and to uphold the 2016 arbitral ruling and UNCLOS, for instance, when he gave a speech on the anniversary of the UN. So we see this particular U-turn and the expansion. In fact, the largest Balikatan exercise in 2022 took place between the U.S. and the Philippines. This is also under Duterte. Now, quickly going to the Marcos Jr. administration, you are absolutely right. And up to this day, the Philippines is not anti-China, which many seem to conveniently espouse. It's not anti-China. Manila is not anti-China. It is against Chinese unilateralism in the West Philippine Sea. So initially, President Marcos Jr., and up to this very point, has been very clear. China is our neighbor. We would have to engage with China. We want to maintain stable relations with China. But the only problem was that, and you're right, the first trip of President Marcos Jr. in 2023 was in Beijing. He met his counterpart, President Xi Jinping, and they talked about establishing hotlines and all these things to manage the situation in the West Philippine Sea. Now, unfortunately, a few weeks after, the China Coast Guards used military-grade lasers, and, that was the beginning of the water cannon incidents. And that, led to the realization in Manila that we need to do something. China does not act on what it says at the political level. What it does at sea is far different. And the hotlines were never picked up, were never used. And China completely ignored that. So as a sovereign state with our own agency and our interest to defend what is rightfully ours for the Filipino people, we sought to leverage our position, our diplomatic relations, and clearly the United States is a huge part in this pushback, and along with other traditional and non-traditional partners as well. So we are merely doing what we can within our capacity to defend what is rightfully ours, and that is also reflected upon through the comprehensive archipelagic defense concept. So we have a lot of things going on, but the common narrative against us is that we don't have our own agency. But clearly, when we look into the public opinion perspective, there's a huge support for what Manila is doing for the West Philippine Sea.
Yeah, and that security architecture that you're talking about is very interesting in part because President Marcos, more than almost any modern Philippine president, has really diversified the security and diplomatic relations of the country, forming partnerships with Japan, Australia, France, the European Union, even Vietnam, and a number of other Southeast Asian countries, diversifying their diplomatic relations. You talked about UNCLOS. For a lot of folks who may not be familiar with that, that's the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. We heard a reference to that with Professor Chen in the CGTN report. And I guess one of the kind of obvious questions that I and a lot of people have is how is it can both the Chinese side and the Philippine side both be citing international law to justify their positions? How can international law be that ambiguous so that both can claim legitimacy in their positions on these territorial disputes? Clearly, the Chinese are using UNCLOS. You mentioned the 2016 tribunal ruling that was in favor of
the arbitral award, yeah.
There we go, the arbitral award that was in favor of the Philippines. Now, that's the basis that both sides use to kind of whack each other over the head. How can they both be right at the same time?
Well, here's the issue. One clause is not ambiguous. It is quite clear. The problem here is that China often misconstrues UNCLOS to the point is that it uses its own terminologies, its local terminologies to explain and to interpret UNCLOS in a particular way. Now, we have to understand, and it's quite ironic, that it was in fact China in the 20th century that was one of the most staunch supporters of having this United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, providing states with their 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. The Philippines was also at the forefront of the negotiations of UNCLOS. And ironically, China was supportive of the idea initially about coastal states having their 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. But here you see China disrespecting the very essence of UNCLOS in that regard by discrediting the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone of the Philippines and other Southeast Asian states. So it's not about the ambiguity of UNCLOS, but the rather blunt and blatant misinterpretation of UNCLOS to the point where China feels that it could throw its weight around and misconstrue that. So for instance, the 9-line, 10-line is clearly not reflective of international law, but rather it is a construct that China tries to project in order to justify its expansionism in the greater South China Sea. So this is an issue, and this is an issue. This is a great issue that China continues to utilize, and it feels that it continues to get away with it because of the asymmetry of power in the region. So it is not about a binding international law, but it's about throwing your weight around and forcing other countries to absorb and to digest its misinterpretation of international law and for others to remain relatively silent about it. So I think that that's clear. The 2016 arbitral award is a complete reflection of UNCLOS as well, and it clearly states that the 9-line or 10-line has no basis under international law. So we have all this evidence here, but what is on the rise is the spread of disinformation about the legitimacy of China's claims. And that is a problem. That is a problem. China was unwilling, for instance, to take part in the investigation on sovereignty claims under the 2016 ruling. So the ruling was on maritime rights, maritime issues rather than issues of sovereignty. And even then, it was quite clear that China was going beyond its legitimate position. And of course, when we look into other aspects, we see that the reason why, for instance, a code of conduct is nowhere to be seen is because China does not want to temper down its claims based on a set of universally agreed upon norms, right? So I think all the evidence is right here. And the mere fact that countries like Vietnam, for instance, are becoming more and more vocal against Chinese atrocities is a clear illustration that even they realize, for instance, that China's desire to expand has no favorites, shows no favorites, and eventually Southeast Asian countries, regardless of alignment, would fall victim to this initial expansionism. And, we've seen that recently. China beat Vietnamese fishermen with clubs, for instance, and that didn't bode well in Hanoi. So we are seeing all this evidence, and I think it's important that we highlight what it is and what it isn't.
And yet, despite the evidence, and you're right that there was that incident at sea between Chinese fishers and Vietnamese fishers, which was quite violent, and Hanoi spoke out and criticized the Chinese for that. But the fact that Hanoi did that was remarkable. It was exceptional because the Vietnamese have taken a very different tact than the Philippines has in terms of their territorial disputes with the Chinese over the South China Sea, what the Vietnamese call the East Vietnam Sea. And they've preferred to go with a more quiet diplomatic route. That mirrors what the Malaysians and also what Indonesia, also claimants in the South China Sea, have done. And one of the tactics that the Chinese are trying to do is to isolate the Philippines and to say, you guys are the troublemakers. You guys are causing the fuss. Look at the Vietnamese, look at the Malaysians, look at ASEAN, look at Indonesia. All of them are negotiating this peacefully and quietly with us, bilaterally. Now we have a situation where even there's been a detente on the India-China border, and that's come into the discussion as well to say, listen, our once bitter foes with the Indians are even able to negotiate with us. Only you Filipinos are the problem, and the reason why you are the problem is because you've got the Americans with a big stick standing behind you. If you didn't have the Americans behind you, you wouldn't be able to do any of this. And so that's the rhetoric coming out of China, trying to isolate the Philippines for their tactics and trying to kind of put divisions in terms of how different Asian and Southeast Asian countries are handling territorial disputes with the Chinese. When you hear that, what do you think?
From the Chinese perspective, that is an oversimplification of what is taking place. And we have to understand the nuance involved in Southeast Asian geopolitics to the point that I've been in several Track 1.5 conferences and discussions with colleagues and counterparts.
Can you explain what Track 1.5 is for our listeners who may not be familiar with that?
Yeah, so Track 1.5 is basically with the involvement of both government and non-government participants. So we talk about government officials and academics, for instance. So it's a mix. And clearly, there is a general agreement that maritime Southeast Asian states are also benefiting from what the Philippines is currently doing. And that in itself is a representation of the significance of what Manila is doing. And our Foreign Affairs Secretary, Mr. Enrique Manalo, has also stated that along with the President Ferdinand Marcos Jr., after the ASEAN meeting in Laos, that there are Southeast Asian states that were clearly supportive of the Philippines' position and were willing to engage more with the Philippines. So we have to understand this nuance first. The second point here is you mentioned about the LAC patrolling agreement, right? And this has also been quite quoted in China, stating that, oh yes, diplomacy matters, etc. But what often happens is that the explanation does not really reflect what has taken place, right? So to say that it was all talk and diplomacy and, nice and rosy conversations that eventually led to the patrolling agreement, that is not true. We have to understand that China responds to risk, and it was because of this that it eventually decided to go forth, for instance, with India. So we have to understand that after the incident in June 2020, the Galwan Valley incident, which led to the death of both sides, Indian and Chinese soldiers, initially China wanted to occupy more parts of the areas within India's side of the line of actual control, or the de facto border that they have there. They tried to occupy the key heights in that area first, but the Indian army eventually operationalized Operation Kailash, which led to the Indian army taking over the strategic heights of the Pangong So, the Pangong Lake, for instance, which was the area of contestation at that time. And because that led to Chinese vulnerability, China then pushed for a de-escalation in that area. But after that, China stalled the discussions for a long time until we saw a number of pushback from India, physical pushback in Arunachal Pradesh, for instance, when China tried to creep in, and also in other parts of the LAC. So we see that the physical deterrence is in fact very important, and the mere fact that India continues to ramp up its military presence along the border, along with the equipment and infrastructure, that eventually applied cost and risk to China's ambitions as well. And we could see that as one of the key elements that led to such talks. And several talks have been stalled since 2020. So we could see that China responds to risk. We have the provisional arrangement, for instance, at the Second Thomas Shoal, or what we call the Ayungin Shoal, which was announced in July 21. If I'm not mistaken, the day before the Philippine president gave his State of the Nation address. Now, the provisional arrangement is basically a de facto sort of arrangement that would lead to Chinese de-escalation in the Ayungin Shoal, which is well within the Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. And one of the reasons why perhaps China led to this was a month after the incident when the Chinese Maritime forces cut off a finger of a Philippine soldier in June 17. So the idea that horizontal escalation was imminent, for instance, when the U.S. said we are willing to go with you at the Ayungin Shoal, for instance, and the risks involved in it, eventually may have led China to consider a provisional arrangement. But however, because of the idea of salami slicing, which has been a key element in China's expansionist ambition, which is to occupy and to provoke certain areas, bit by bit, to eventually create a number of these slices, right? China eventually shifted its direction to the Sabina Shoal, where it tried to block, the Philippine presence there, and also above the airspace of the Scarborough Shoal, or the Bajo de Masinloc, also within Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone. So it is trying to take the fight elsewhere while de-escalating the situation at the Ayungin Shoal. So the idea here is risk is needed for China to respond. And the mere fact that China, with regards to Vietnam, for instance, is insisting on more claims into the Gulf of Tonkin, for instance, and is also provoking Vietnamese national security interests through the canal project with Cambodia, for instance, is a clear realization that Vietnam also is not satisfied with its relationship with China, but is using a different approach, of course, from the Philippines. But then again, to say that they are satisfied with the relationship, I think is again another oversimplification. So it would just be a matter of time, if this sort of intensification continues. And we see, so for the first time, two claimant states of the Greater South China Sea issue, the Philippines and Vietnam, conducted confidence-building measures through maritime security cooperation. So while it is prudent and not involving of traditional security, this is a step forward in confidence building. And if this could follow suit, could create an issue for China's divide and conquer strategy, right? So we are looking into these elements as they unfold.
But I would be a little bit cautious there, only because the Vietnamese strategy tends to be on strategic balance. So while that was happening, where the Coast Guards from Vietnam and the Philippines were working together and doing their training exercises, the Vietnamese Navy sent a frigate to port in Guangzhou. and Guangdong province. And so they wanted to kind of show balance. And at the same time, for example, last year when Prime Minister Chin went up to meet with Xi Jinping, he had the USS Ronald Reagan docked in Da Nang. So they're constantly striving for these balance. So whenever it looks like the Vietnamese are tilting towards one side or the other, typically if you lift up the leaf, you'll see the other balance there. So a lot of people focused on the Philippine-Vietnamese Coast Guard exercises, but missed the frigate in Guangdong province. And that's always there. And that's the Vietnamese strategy, is to always kind of maintain a certain degree of balance in that. I'm trying to kind of focus a little bit more now on the U.S. role, because this is absolutely essential. And we talked about at the beginning that there is a, pun intended, a trump card here within the name of Donald Trump himself. So again, the Philippines is different than the Vietnamese because they've got this security treaty that's, 75 years old, and it assures that the United States, if called upon by the Philippines, will come in to defend the Philippines. And that is a terrifying prospect on one sense because the United States is legally bound by this alliance partnership to do that. It's terrifying because it could lead to a full-scale confrontation between the two largest navies in the world, something that should keep us all up at night. Now, the question is, will the United States follow through on those treaty partnerships now, especially in the Trump administration? Donald Trump has made it very clear that if he doesn't see something in America's very narrow national security interest, he's not going to support it. There's been a lot of speculation in the Philippines that's saying everything's fine, don't worry, the Americans are going to be as reliable as ever. I, for one, have a hard time believing that the United States would embark on effectively what could be World War III over some disputed shoals on behalf of the Philippines. That just doesn't seem to be in line with the current vibe in the United States right now. Talk to us a little bit about the confidence that Filipinos have in this U.S. security partnership and whether or not, if called upon, the U.S. Navy will come to its aid.
So that's a very pertinent question, and one that requires step back to Trump 1.0 to better understand the dynamics between the Philippines and the U.S. under Trump. So yes, you're absolutely right. There are concerns across Asia, across the Indo-Pacific, regarding especially the treaty allies such as South Korea and Japan, for instance, regarding the level of commitment that Washington would have in terms of its security alignments and security partnerships with its treaty allies. So these are practical concerns, given, of course, the situation in Europe and how initially Trump was showing that sort of dissatisfaction towards NATO and all that. Now, we have to understand the idea of America first, right? And that has been one of the common reference points in trying to understand Trump's foreign policy. And it's all about maintaining U.S. preeminence, right? Not necessarily maintaining or securing the rules-based order. So if we look into the Indo-Pacific, for instance, which is a vital area for U.S. national interests, and whether you look at it narrowly speaking, it is vital nonetheless. And what is the most controversial element that provokes this U.S. preeminence interest? And it's clearly China. China does not only have the material capabilities, but the political will to actually push back against U.S. national interests. So in this regard, we see that the U.S. will likely pay close attention to what takes place in the Indo-Pacific. Now, we talk about the alliance dynamics, right? As early as 2019, for instance, it was in fact the Trump administration that clarified the geographic scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Philippines and the U.S. When Secretary Mike Pompeo arrived in Manila, he clarified that the West Philippine Sea is included within this, and this wasn't seen during the previous administration of Obama, for instance. And of course, this was also the time when the Trump administration rejected nearly all Chinese claims in the Greater South China Sea, including the West Philippine Sea. So there is that clear element. Now, the issue then was that we were under Duterte, who was not really overtly supportive of having the U.S. play a more effective role in Philippine foreign policy. So we were giving the cold shoulder to the U.S. And of course, that really did not allow us to maximize anything with the U.S. in terms of that. So it is not fair to say that it didn't work out during that time because of Donald Trump's, for instance, insistence on burden sharing, etc., because we did not really match up that level at that point. But if we look into other examples, such as Japan, and this shows you how personality matters, right? So Shinzo Abe, for instance, had a positive rapport with Donald Trump, and that led to the U.S. more willingly maximizing the potential of the Japan-U.S. alliance, right? And this was compared to South Korea, which did not gain much prominence in Trump's security calculations. But then again, this shows you how personality matters within Trump's foreign policy. Now, fast forward to the contemporary situation. In fact, upon the electoral victory, President Marcos Jr. already exchanged text messages with President-elect Trump, and this shows you how Marcos Jr. realized the need to sort of reach out and to interact with the upcoming administration. They had a phone call as well separately. So what I feel is that within Trump's transactional worldview, the challenge here for the Philippines would be to position Philippine national interests in a way that would show that our interests in keeping the security of the West Philippine Sea also is similar or also intersects with the interests of maintaining U.S. preeminence, for instance. So it's a transactional perspective of international politics, and the challenge would be to fit our interests within that worldview as well. So in that case, we see a lot of potential for collaboration, but also at the same time, however, there are challenges, such as one that revolves around the economic aspect. The idea of friendshoring, for instance, will not hold under Trump, and the idea that the Philippines would need to or could be complacent in gaining economic partnerships with the U.S., I think would be challenged, given that even then we have been falling back vis-a-vis the Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam when it comes to FDIs, for instance. So we would have to do more in that regard, given the profit-based approach. But then again, the question on whether the U.S. would come to our defense, etc., if something erupts in the West Philippine Sea, I feel that obviously we can only speculate for now, but I do not see the U.S. not showing up in that regard, because primarily it would matter a lot to U.S. national security. But again, this is not the time for complacency, and I've also advocated for the need to pursue and to continue pursuing multi-alignment. We need to work closely with Japan, given that it is the first island chain, for instance, that is the most vulnerable when it comes to that aspect. So we need to work closely with Japan, who I feel is fast gaining its position in Philippine foreign policy of that is close to the U.S. position as a quasi-alliance, right? So we see the need for multi-alignment as well, along with our engagements with the U.S. So absolutely, keeping options open is the most prudent way, but also understanding how we negotiate and to improve our negotiation skills with Washington under Trump would be of more importance for Manila right now.
And let's not forget that the Philippines is home to the world's second largest reserves of nickel, which for the most part, unlike in Indonesia, is not tainted by the Chinese supply chain. And I say tainted only because in the Inflation Reduction Act that the United States passed under the Biden administration, they tried to kind of separate the Chinese from the critical mineral supply chain. And for the most part, I think entirely, there's no Chinese investment in the nickel mining and extraction business in the Philippines right now. So when we think of transactions with the United States, that could be one where they look at. Don, we've covered a lot of ground in this discussion. There's a lot to kind of take in. We're at the end of the year now. It's been a rather difficult year in China-Philippines relations. We're going into the new year. Help everybody understand a little bit more about what we should expect maybe in 2025. Again, we have the Trump question there, and I would urge you and everybody in the Philippines to resist the notion that Trump 1 was a certain way, so Trump 2 is going to be the same way. I think the dynamics in the U.S. are radically different than they were 4 years ago, and the Trump administration is very different. It looks like the incoming one is going to be very different than it was 4 years ago. Nonetheless, give us your 2025 predictions, forecasts, expectations of what you see unfolding in the South China Sea, West Philippine Sea, between China and the Philippines.
Well, when it comes to a bilateral relationship, we would clearly see the Philippines working with China on different areas of cooperation. That would continue. Keeping all lines of communication open, that would also continue. Now, the challenge here is to what point China will try to continue pushing the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea. So obviously, we have the midterm elections, for instance, and the 2028 elections coming up next year, the next 3 years. So these are important dates for China, given that Philippine foreign policy has not really been consistent in that regard. So it is also banking on the idea of a change in government eventually. So it is trying to buy its time and for the meantime trying to intimidate the Philippines in that regard. So the challenge now for the Philippines would be to ensure relative continuity with what Manila is currently doing now towards the security of the West Philippine Sea. There needs to be a need to institutionalize existing partnerships and also at the same time to build on our external capacity to deal with China and of course to create more awareness within the country as well. I think one of the major issues that we would face would be a more notorious level of malign information operations, which were actually on the rise as early as 2023. But the Philippine public remains resilient against these malign information operations because of the government's current, it's a cliche word, but it's actually unfolding right now, the whole of a nation approach where civil society is actually engaging closely with state actors when it comes to the West Philippine Sea issue. So that has been a huge call. But we will see a clear rise and increase in malign information operations and of course more atrocities perhaps taking place in the West Philippine Sea physically speaking. We see China now trying to escalate the situation at Pag-asa, which is part of the Kalayaan group of islands, which is a municipality of the province of Palawan of the Philippines. So we're seeing more escalation there. We're seeing continuous provocative activity taking place at the Sabina Shoal or the Escoda Shoal, for instance. So we would see more likely more of these salami slicing strategies in the long term. But the problem and the challenge here is to maintain a consistent outlook. Now look, whether we are doing the right things now, we won't be able to see the results as we plan or as we hope. 6 years won't be enough to deal with something that has been going on since the 1970s, 1980s. And old habits die hard when it comes to China. So we would need to show more consistency in our policy planning for the long term. As I mentioned, China has been consistent since 1949. And for the Philippines to ensure consistency with our security position right now would be crucial to materialize the benefits of the efforts that are currently unfolding today. So that would be the challenge, really. I think that would be the major challenge, is to ensure policy continuity in the long run. And that would eventually determine the future of relations between the Philippines and China in the West Philippine Sea.
Sounds like it's going to be another bumpy year ahead in the South China Sea and the relations between the two countries. Don, thank you so much for taking your time today to walk us through all of this. It's very complicated, very nuanced, and yet you were able to explain it to us in a very easy to understand way. Don McLain Gill is a Manila-based geopolitical analyst, author, and lecturer at the Department of International Studies at Salle University in the Philippines. He's also a non-resident fellow at the Strat-based ADR Institute in Manila. Don, thank you so much again for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Eric. It's a true pleasure to have this conversation with you.
And just before we go, we always get criticisms and comments from listeners who say, why don't we have a Chinese perspective on this? And I just want to be upfront and straightforward. I sent out 5 invitations to Chinese scholars and analysts over the past week, and as per usual, no one responded. So I don't expect them to respond, but I do want to always make the invitation. And I also want to let you know that we do try to get Chinese scholars and analysts and perspectives on the show because we want to provide insights on all sides to this, but unfortunately, it's just the reality we live in today that it's not possible. So let's leave our conversation there. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China Global South podcast. For Cobus Van Staden, who normally joins us from South Africa, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another episode. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Follow the China Global South Project on Twitter at ChinaGS Project and share your thoughts on today's show, or head over to our website at ChinaGlobalSouth.com, where you can subscribe to receive full access to more than 5,000 articles and podcasts. Once again, that's ChinaGlobalSouth.com.